In the quietude of her small apartment, the hum of the refrigerator a distant lullaby. Clara sat hunched over her kitchen table, the dim glow of the screen casting ghostly shadows on her face. The email had arrived moments ago, slipping into her inbox like a whisper in the night. The subject line was stark, demanding attention. A message from God while you are being isolated. Don't miss this final chosen one warning. Her heart pounded a staccato rhythm against her ribs as she hovered the cursor over the message. The world outside her window was a ghost town, streets, deserted shops shuttered, a silent testament to the isolation that had become their collective reality. She had felt the weight of it, the crushing solitude, the gnawing fear that gnawed at the edges of her sanity. But this was different. This was a message, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. With a deep breath, she clicked. The screen flickered, the words swimming into focus, each one a stone cast into the still waters of her mind, sending ripples of unease through her. It spoke of divine intervention, of a world purged of its wickedness, of a chosen few spared to rebuild, to repopulate, to carry the torch of humanity into a new dawn. It spoke of her, of the isolation she felt, the loneliness she had come to know so intimately, as a sign, a marker of her selection. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the words, her heart, a tumult of fear and hope, of dread and longing. She wanted to believe, to find solace in the notion that there was a reason, a purpose to this madness. But the voice of reason, that insidious whisper in the back of her mind, cautioned her, warned her of the folly of such beliefs. Yet the email persisted, a siren song calling her to the edge of reason, beckoning her to leap into the abyss of faith. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful dirge that echoed her turmoil. The trees, skeletal in their nakedness, swayed and danced, their shadows flickering against the window pane, like spectral hands reaching out to her. She felt a chill, a cold that seeped into her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. The email spoke of a final warning, a last chance to repent, to atone, to prove herself worthy. It spoke of a test, a trial by fire that would separate the wheat from the chaff, the chosen from the damned. It spoke of a message, a divine communication that would come, a sign that would reveal itself to the faithful, to those who believed, to those who were willing to see. Clara's hands trembled as she reached for her phone, the need to share this, to connect, to reach out to someone, anyone overwhelming. But the screen remained dark, the silence echoing the emptiness she felt. She was alone, truly alone, in a way she had never been before. The isolation, the loneliness, the fear, it was all-encompassing, a physical entity that pressed down on her, threatening to crush her beneath its weight. She looked back at the screen, at the words that seemed to pulse and throb, a living entity that breathed and pulsed with a life of its own. She felt a pull, a tugging at the edges of her consciousness, a whisper that called her name, a voice that promised salvation, that promised answers. She wanted to believe, to surrender, to let go of the doubt, the fear, the uncertainty. She wanted to believe that there was a reason, a purpose, a meaning to this madness. But the voice of reason persisted, a stubborn echo that refused to be silenced. It whispered of scams, of hoaxes, of the desperate grasping at straws, of the need to find meaning in the meaningless. It warned her of the danger, of the folly, of the madness that lurked in the shadows, waiting to consume her, to devour her, to swallow her whole. Clara felt a tear slip down her cheek, a solitary drop that traced a path of fire down her skin. She felt the weight of the world on her shoulders, the burden of her isolation, the crushing loneliness that threatened to consume her. She felt the pull of the email, the siren song that called to her, promised her answers, promised her salvation. But she also felt the weight of her doubt, the burden of her fear, the crushing uncertainty that gnawed at her, that threatened to consume her. She felt the tug of war, the battle between faith and reason, between hope and despair, between belief and doubt. She felt the struggle, the turmoil, the madness that threatened to consume her, to swallow her whole. And in that moment, as she sat there hunched over her kitchen table, the dim glow of the screen casting ghostly shadows on her face, she made a choice. She chose to believe, to hope, to surrender to the madness, to the faith, to the promise of salvation. She chose to believe that there was a reason, a purpose, a meaning to this isolation, to this loneliness, to this fear. She chose to believe that she was chosen, that she was special, that she was meant for something greater, something more. She chose to believe that the email was a sign, a beacon, a message from God, a final warning, a last chance to repent, to atone, to prove herself worthy. And with that choice, she felt a peace, a calm, a stillness that washed over her, that enveloped her, that consumed her. She felt the weight lift, the burden ease, the fear dissipate. She felt the hope, the faith, the belief that she was chosen, that she was special, that she was meant for something greater, something more. She closed her eyes, a small smile playing on her lips, and she whispered a prayer, a plea, a promise to the divine, to the God who had chosen her, who had marked her, who had saved her. She promised to be worthy, to be faithful, to be true. She promised to be the chosen one, the final warning, the last hope, the beacon of light in the encroaching darkness. And as she sat there in the quietude of her small apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, a distant lullaby, she felt a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, a sense of belonging. She felt the isolation lift, the loneliness ease, the fear dissipate. She felt the hope, the faith, the belief that she was chosen, that she was special, that she was meant for something greater, something more. She felt the promise of a new dawn, of a new beginning, of a new world. She felt the promise of salvation, of redemption, of a life lived in faith, in hope, in belief. She felt the promise of a message from God, of a final warning, of a last chance to repent, to atone, to prove herself worthy. And she knew in that moment that she would never be the same. She knew that she was changed, that she was transformed, that she was reborn. She knew that she was the chosen one, the final warning, the last hope, the beacon of light in the encroaching darkness. She knew that she was meant for something greater, something more. She knew that she was meant to be the message, the warning, the hope, the light. And with that knowledge, she opened her eyes, a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, a sense of belonging, filling her, consuming her, transforming her. She stood her chair, scraping against the floor, a sound that echoed in the silence, a sound that marked the beginning of her journey, her purpose, her destiny. She walked to the window, her steps steady, her resolve unwavering. She looked out at the world, at the isolation, at the loneliness, at the fear. And she saw for the first time the promise, the hope, the belief. She saw the world as it was meant to be, as it could be, as it would be. She saw the dawn, the new beginning, the new world. And she knew in that moment that she was ready. She was ready to be the chosen one, the final warning, the last hope, the beacon of light in the encroaching darkness. She was ready to be the message, the warning, the hope, the light. She was ready to be the one who would lead them out of the darkness, out of the isolation, out of the fear. She was ready to be the one who would bring them hope, who would bring them faith, who would bring them belief. She was ready to be the one who would change the world. The room was thick with silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. The screen flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls as the message continued to loop. The words, 3, a message from God while you are being isolated. Don't miss this final chosen one warning, seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The voice when it spoke was not the booming, thunderous voice one might expect from a divine entity. Instead, it was soft, almost gentle, like the rustling of leaves in a quiet forest. It spoke of isolation not as a punishment, but as a necessity. A means to protect, to preserve, to prepare. The words were cryptic, yet they resonated with a profound truth that sent shivers down the spine. Outside, the world had grown eerily quiet. The usual hum of traffic, the distant chatter of people, the occasional bark of a dog, all had vanished, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The streets were empty, the houses dark, their inhabitants huddled inside, their eyes glued to their screens, listening to the message that had descended upon them like a divine edict. The air was thick with a sense of anticipation, a feeling that something monumental was about to happen, something that would change the course of history forever. In the quietude, one could almost hear the whispers of the universe, the faint hum of existence itself. It was as if the world had been paused, frozen in a moment of suspended animation, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The message from God had cast a spell over the world, binding it in a cocoon of isolation, a sanctuary from the chaos that lay beyond. And in that silence, in that stillness, the people of the world began to reflect, to ponder, to seek understanding. They were no longer just individuals, no longer just isolated souls. They were part of something greater, something divine. They were the chosen ones, and they were being prepared for a destiny that was yet to be revealed. In the quietude of her small apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, a distant lullaby, Clara found herself drawn to the flickering screen of her laptop. The email had arrived unannounced, slipping into her inbox like a whisper in the night. The subject line pulsed with an urgency that made her heart stutter. A message from God while you are being isolated. Don't miss this final chosen one warning. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant. The world outside her window was a ghost town, streets. Empty stores shuttered. Isolation had become the norm, a silent, invisible force that had pushed humanity apart. Clara had felt the weight of it, the loneliness, the fear. But this was different. This was a message, a beacon in the darkness. She took a deep breath, the air heavy with the scent of lavender from the candle on her desk. The flame flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. With a click, she opened the email. The words swam before her eyes, blurry with unshed tears. Clara, it began, her name a balm to her soul. You have been chosen, not for greatness, not for glory, but for something far more profound. You have been chosen to bear witness, to see the truth in the isolation, the purpose in the solitude. The words washed over her, a tide of emotion threatening to drown her. She read on each sentence a revelation, a piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was trying to solve. The message spoke of a world on the brink of a humanity lost in the noise of its own making. It spoke of a God who wept for his children, who longed to gather them close to whisper words of love and comfort. But there was a warning too, a final desperate warning. The isolation was not just a punishment, not just a test. It was a gift, a chance to reflect, to repent, to return, a chance to choose love over fear, unity over division. The message was clear. The time for choice was now. The time for action was now. The time for change was now. Clara's hands trembled as she finished reading. The weight of the message settled over her, a mantle she wasn't sure she was strong enough to bear. But there was a fire in her chest, a spark of defiance, of hope. She looked out the window at the empty streets, the silent world, and she knew what she had to do. She would not let this message be lost. She would not let this warning go unheeded. She would be the voice in the wilderness, the light in the darkness. She would be the chosen one, and she would not miss this final warning. The room was thick with silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. The screen flickered, casting eerie shadows on the faces of the gathered individuals. They had come from all walks of life, drawn by the cryptic message that had appeared on their devices, a message that claimed to be a final warning from a higher power. The room was a nondescript conference hall, its walls bare except for a large screen that now displayed a simple, stark image, a hand reaching out from a void, fingers splayed in a gesture that seemed both pleading and commanding. The air was heavy with anticipation, a palpable tension that seemed to hum in the silence. The people in the room exchanged glances, their eyes reflecting a mix of skepticism, hope, and fear. Some clutched their phones tightly, as if the devices were lifelines connecting them to something beyond their comprehension. Others fidgeted their fingers, tapping nervously against their knees or the arms of their chairs. A few sat motionless, their gazes fixed on the screen, their expressions unreadable. Then, without warning, the image on the screen began to change. The hand dissolved into a swirl of colors, a kaleidoscope of hues that seemed to pulse and throb with an otherworldly rhythm. The colors coalesced into a figure, a being of light and shadow, its form both familiar and alien. It had the rough shape of a human, but its features were indistinct, shifting and changing as if caught between dimensions. The figure seemed to look out at the assembled crowd, its gaze sweeping over them like a physical touch. A voice filled the room, resonant and deep, yet somehow androgynous, devoid of any discernible accent or inflection. It was a voice that seemed to vibrate in the very air, a sound that was both heard and felt. It spoke in a language that was somehow understood by all, a language of the soul rather than the mind. "We are the ones who have watched over you," the voice intoned, "who have guided and protected you since the dawn of your existence. We are the ones you have called gods, spirits, ancestors' guides. We are the ones who have whispered in your dreams and spoken through your prophets. We are the ones who have tried to show you the path to lead you away from the abyss that yawns before you." The figure on the screen seemed to grow larger, its form becoming more distinct, more solid. It was as if the very act of speaking was giving it substance, drawing it into their world. The people in the room leaned forward, their breath catching in their throats, their hearts pounding in their chests. They were no longer skeptical, no longer afraid. They were enraptured, drawn into the orbit of this being, this messenger from beyond. "We have tried to warn you," the voice continued, "to show you the consequences of your actions. We have sent signs and omens, visions and dreams. We have spoken through those who would listen, who would heed our words. But you have turned away, closed your eyes and your hearts to our warnings. You have chosen the path of destruction, the path of self-annihilation." The figure on the screen seemed to grow darker, its form shifting and changing, becoming more ominous. The colors that had once been vibrant and bright now took on a sinister hue, a deep, foreboding red that seemed to bleed into the shadows. "You stand on the precipice," the voice warned, "the edge of the abyss. One step more, and you will fall plunging into the darkness that awaits you. You will take your world with you, your beautiful, fragile world. You will destroy the gift that was given to you, the gift of life, of love, of existence." The figure seemed to reach out its hands, stretching towards them, its fingers curling as if in supplication. The people in the room felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of loss, a grief that was both personal and universal. They saw in their mind's eye the world as it was, the beauty and the wonder of it, the love and the laughter. They saw the potential for destruction, the path that led to the abyss. They saw the choice that lay before them. "You are the chosen ones," the voice said, its tone softening, becoming almost gentle. "You are the ones who have been given this warning, this final chance to turn back, to choose a different path. You are the ones who must carry this message, who must spread the word, who must lead your people away from the edge." The figure on the screen began to fade its form, dissolving into the swirl of colors once more. The voice grew fainter, its words echoing in the silence like a distant bell. "Remember," it whispered, "the choice is yours. The path is before you. Choose wisely, chosen ones. Choose life." And then it was gone, the screen returning to its stark blank state. The room was filled with a profound silence, a hush that seemed to reverberate with the weight of the message they had received. The people in the room looked at each other, their eyes reflecting a mix of awe, fear, and determination. They knew what they had to do. They were the chosen ones, the messengers, the leaders. They were the ones who would save their world. The room was bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of the screen, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to whisper secrets of their own. The air was thick with an almost palpable tension, a sense of anticipation that clung to the walls like a second skin. The message, those stark black words against the stark white background, seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, as if each letter was a living thing, throbbing with the heartbeat of the divine. The woman, her eyes wide and reflective like pools of moonlight, reached out a trembling hand towards the screen. Her fingers hovered just above the surface as if afraid to make contact, as if the slightest touch might shatter the illusion, the reality of what she was seeing. The words seemed to blur and swim before her eyes, the letters rearranging themselves, forming new sentences, new meanings, as if the message was a living, breathing entity capable of change, of growth. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to laugh, to cry, to scream. The emotions welled up inside her, a tumultuous storm of joy, fear, and disbelief. This was it, she thought, the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she had prayed for. The message was clear, unmistakable. It was a call to arms, a rallying cry from the heavens themselves. The end was near, and she was one of the chosen, one of the few who had been deemed worthy to receive this final desperate warning. But with the joy came a creeping, insidious fear. What did this mean? What was expected of her? She was just a woman after all, a simple, ordinary woman with no special skills or talents. How could she, of all people, be expected to save the world? The thought was laughable, absurd, and yet there it was, staring her in the face, as undeniable as the sun in the sky. She took a deep, shuddering breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She knew with a certainty that bordered on the divine that her life would never be the same. She was a soldier now, a warrior in the army of the righteous. And she could not fail. With a sudden, decisive movement, she reached out and touched the screen. The words seemed to leap out at her, burning themselves into her retina, searing themselves into her very soul. She felt a jolt like a bolt of lightning, a surge of energy that coursed through her veins, filling her with a sense of purpose, of destiny. She stood up, her chair clattering to the floor behind her. She felt tall, invincible, as if she had been infused with the very essence of the divine. She looked around her at the familiar surroundings of her home and saw them anew, as if through the eyes of a stranger. This was her domain, now her kingdom, and she would defend it with her life if necessary. She walked to the window, her steps echoing in the sudden silence. She looked out at the world beyond, at the trees, the buildings, the people going about their daily lives, oblivious to the storm that was brewing on the horizon. She felt a pang of sorrow, of loss. They were all so innocent, so unaware, and she was the only one who could save them. She turned away from the window, her resolve hardening like steel. She knew what she had to do. She had to spread the word, to warn the others, to rally them to her cause. She had to prepare them for what was to come, for the trials and tribulations that lay ahead. She had to be their leader, their guide, their savior. She walked back to the computer, her steps filled with a newfound determination. She sat down, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She took a deep breath and began to type. The words flowed from her like a river, a torrent of divine inspiration, a message from the heavens themselves. She wrote of the end times, of the apocalypse that was fast approaching. She wrote of the chosen ones, of the few who would be spared, who would inherit the earth. She wrote of the battles to come, of the blood that would be spilled, of the sacrifices that would be made. And as she wrote, she felt a sense of peace, of calm. She knew that she was doing the right thing, that she was fulfilling her destiny. She was the messenger, the herald of the new age. And she would not rest until her message had been heard, until the world had been warned. She worked through the night, her fingers flying over the keys, her eyes burning with a fervent, almost fanatical light. She wrote and wrote, pouring her heart and soul into her work until the first light of dawn began to filter through the window, casting long golden fingers of light across the room. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the pages she had written. She felt a sense of satisfaction, of accomplishment. She had done it. She had fulfilled her mission. She had delivered the message. She stood up, her body aching from the long hours of work. She stretched her muscles, protesting, her joints creaking. She walked to the window, her steps slow, deliberate. She looked out at the world beyond, at the new day dawning, at the promise of a new beginning. She smiled a small, secret smile. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, that there would be challenges and obstacles to overcome. But she also knew that she was ready, that she was prepared. She was a soldier, a warrior, a chosen one. And she would not falter, would not fail. She turned away from the window, her mind already racing ahead, already planning, already strategizing. She walked back to the computer, her steps filled with purpose, with determination. She sat down, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She took a deep breath and began to type once more. The message had been delivered, but the work was far from over. The battle had only just begun. The room was thick with silence, the kind that presses against your eardrums and makes you feel as though you're submerged in an invisible, soundless ocean. The screen flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced macabrely on the walls, and the air was heavy with an almost palpable sense of anticipation. The message had been clear, its words etched into the collective consciousness of those who had received it. A warning, a plea, a final call to arms from an entity that claimed to be divine. In the heart of the city, amidst the concrete jungle and the neon glow, a man sat alone in his dimly lit apartment. His name was Elias, and he was one of the few who had heeded the message. He was not a religious man, nor was he particularly spiritual. He was a skeptic, a realist, a man who had always placed his faith in science and logic. But there was something about the message that had resonated with him, something that had burrowed its way into his mind and refused to let go. He stared at the screen, his eyes tracing the words that had been etched into his memory. "The end is nigh," it had said, "and you are being isolated for a reason. The final chosen one will rise, and only they will have the power to save what is left of your world." It was a message that was both cryptic and chilling, a harbinger of doom that had sent shockwaves through the digital landscape. Elias leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. He was a man of action, a problem solver, and he had spent the last few hours trying to decipher the message, to find some semblance of meaning in the chaos. He had pored over religious texts, scoured the internet for any hint of a pattern, and even attempted to contact the few people he knew who might have some insight. But it was all to no avail. The message was a riddle wrapped in an enigma, and he was no closer to understanding it than he had been when he first received it. Outside, the world continued on as if nothing had happened. The streets were still filled with people, the shops still bustled with activity, and the sky was still painted with the vibrant hues of the setting sun. But Elias knew that something was different. He could feel it in the air, a tangible shift in the atmosphere that was as real as the chair he was sitting on. The message had changed, something had set something in motion, and he was determined to find out what it was. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor with a loud grating sound. He walked over to the window, his eyes scanning the cityscape below. It was a view that he had seen 1,000 times before, but it had never looked quite like this. The buildings seemed to loom over him, their windows like countless eyes watching his every move. The streets were a maze of shadows and light, a labyrinth that seemed to stretch out into infinity. Elias took a deep breath, his mind made up. He couldn't sit here and do nothing. He had to find out what was going on, had to uncover the truth behind the message. He grabbed his jacket, his keys, and his phone and headed for the door. As he stepped out into the hallway, he could feel the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. But he was ready. He was Elias the skeptic, the realist, the man who had always placed his faith in science and logic. And he was about to embark on a journey that would test the very limits of his beliefs. The elevator ride down to the lobby was a blur, his mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts. He stepped out into the bustling street, the noise and the chaos assaulting his senses. He walked briskly, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of something, anything that might give him a clue. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he knew he would recognize it when he saw it. He walked for hours, his feet carrying him through the city like a man possessed. He talked to people, asked questions, searched for any hint of a pattern, but it was all to no avail. The city was a puzzle, a riddle that seemed to have no solution. He was about to give up, to admit defeat, and return to the solitude of his apartment when he saw it. It was a small, unassuming building, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It was old, its brick facade weathered by time and the elements, but there was something about it, something that drew Elias in. He approached it cautiously, his eyes scanning the building for any sign of life. There was a small sign above the door, its letters faded and worn. It read, "The Church of the Final Chosen One." Elias hesitated, his hand hovering over the door handle. He wasn't a religious man, and he had no idea what he would find inside. But he knew that he had to go in, that this was the clue he had been searching for. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open, stepping into the dimly lit interior. The church was small, its pews worn, and its walls adorned with faded paintings of saints and angels. At the front of the church, a man stood behind a podium, his eyes closed in prayer. He was an older man, his hair gray, and his face lined with wrinkles. But there was a sense of peace about him, a calm that seemed to radiate outwards and fill the entire church. Elias approached him cautiously, his eyes scanning the man for any sign of recognition. The man opened his eyes, his gaze meeting Elias's. There was a moment of silence, a moment that seemed to stretch out into eternity. Then the man spoke. "Welcome, Elias," he said, his voice soft and gentle. "I've been expecting you." Elias was taken aback, his mind racing with 1,000 different thoughts. He had never seen this man before, had never even heard of this church. But the man seemed to know him, seemed to be expecting him. He was about to ask how the man knew his name when the man spoke again. "I am Father Michael," he said, "and I believe I have something that you're looking for." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn book. Its cover was faded and its pages yellowed with age, but there was a sense of power about it, a sense of something ancient and profound. He handed the book to Elias, his eyes never leaving his. "Read it," he said, "and you will understand." Elias took the book, his fingers tracing the worn cover. He didn't know what he was expecting, but he knew that this was the clue he had been searching for. He opened the book, his eyes scanning the pages. And as he read, he began to understand. The book was a journal, a record of the life of a man who had lived centuries ago. It was a story of faith and doubt, of struggle and redemption, of a man who had been chosen for a purpose that he did not understand. And as Elias read, he began to see the parallels between the man's life and his own. He read for hours, his eyes tracing the words on the page. And as he read, he began to understand the message, to see the truth that had been hidden in plain sight. The final chosen one was not a person, but an idea, a concept, a force that could save the world from the darkness that threatened to consume it. And Elias was the one who had been chosen to bring this idea into the world, to spread the message and to save what was left of humanity. He closed the book, his mind made up. He knew what he had to do, knew the path that lay before him. He turned to Father Michael, his eyes filled with a newfound determination. "I understand," he said, "and I'm ready." Father Michael smiled, a sense of peace washing over him. He had found the final chosen one, the man who would save the world from the darkness. And as Elias stepped out into the night, he knew that the journey that lay before him would be a long and difficult one. But he was ready. He was Elias the skeptic, the realist, the man who had been chosen to save the world. And he was about to embark on a journey that would change the course of history forever. The room was bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of the screen, the words seemingly dancing on the surface, inviting yet ominous. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, a palpable sense of anticipation that clung to the walls like a second skin. The message, cryptic and enigmatic, had cast a spell over the room, binding its occupants in a shared moment of suspense. The man whose name was John felt a strange sensation creep up his spine, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. His eyes were glued to the screen, his mind racing, trying to decipher the meaning behind the words. He was no stranger to the mysteries of the universe, having spent a lifetime in pursuit of answers. But this was different. This was a message from God, or so it claimed, and it had been sent to him and him alone. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, itching to respond, to engage with the divine entity that had reached out to him. But he hesitated, a small voice in the back of his mind, whispering warnings of deception, of trickery. He had been taught to be wary, to question, to seek proof. But what proof could there be for a message from God? He was treading on sacred ground, venturing into realms where even the most learned of men feared to go. The woman Sarah stood by the window, her arms wrapped around herself in a protective gesture. She had been silent since the message had appeared, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and awe. She was a woman of faith, her beliefs unshaken, yet this was a test of her convictions. She looked at John, her eyes searching, seeking reassurance, guidance. But he was as lost as she was, his usual confidence replaced with a sense of vulnerability that was both unsettling and humbling. The message was a warning, a final chosen one warning, it said, but a warning against what the words were vague, open to interpretation, yet they carried a weight that was undeniable. It spoke of isolation, of a purpose yet to be revealed, of a path that only the chosen one could tread. It was a call to action, a summons to a destiny that was both terrifying and exhilarating. John took a deep breath, his fingers finally finding the keys. He began to type his words slow and deliberate, each one a step into the unknown. He asked the question that had been burning in his mind, the question that had brought him to this point. "What is it that you want of me?" He wrote, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath caught in his throat. The room held its breath, the air thick with anticipation. The screen flickered, the words shifting, rearranging themselves into a new message. It was a response, a reply from the divine entity that had reached out to him. It was an answer to his question, a revelation of the path that lay ahead. And as he read the words, John felt a sense of purpose wash over him, a calling that was both profound and terrifying. He was the chosen one, and his journey was about to begin. The room was bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of the screen, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to whisper secrets of their own. The air was thick with an almost palpable tension, a sense of anticipation that clung to the walls like a second skin. The message, those stark black words against the white backdrop, seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, demanding attention, commanding understanding. The woman, her eyes wide and reflective, like pools of dark water, leaned closer to the screen. Her breath hitched in her throat, a small, almost imperceptible sound in the otherwise silent room. The words swam before her eyes, their meaning both clear and utterly incomprehensible. A message from God, a warning, the final chosen one. The phrases tumbled around in her mind, each one more bewildering than the last. She reached out a tentative hand, her fingers hovering just above the keyboard. The urge to respond, to ask for clarification, to demand more information was almost overwhelming. But something held her back, a sense of reverence, of awe. This was not a conversation to be entered into lightly. This was a message from God after all. Not a text from a friend, not an email from a colleague. This was divine communication, and it deserved her utmost respect, her utmost consideration. Her hand dropped to her lap, her fingers curling into a loose fist. She took a deep breath, her eyes never leaving the screen. She needed to think, to process, to understand. The world outside her window had gone eerily quiet, as if even nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for her response. But she couldn't think about that, not now. She needed to focus, to grapple with the message before her, to unravel its meaning, to decipher its code. The words began to blur the longer she stared at them. Her eyes burned with the effort, with the emotion, with the sheer magnitude of what she was reading. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her vision, trying to maintain her composure. This was not the time to fall apart. This was the time to be strong, to be brave, to be the chosen one that the message spoke of. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the room as if seeking answers in the familiar surroundings. The bookshelves lined with well-loved tomes, the comfortable couch draped with a hand-knitted throw, the potted plants that added a touch of green to the otherwise neutral palette. It was all so normal, so ordinary. And yet here she was in the midst of the extraordinary, the divine, the otherworldly. Her gaze returned to the screen, to the message that had turned her world upside down. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know what being the chosen one entailed. But she knew one thing for certain. She was ready, ready to listen, ready to learn, ready to lead, ready to be the chosen one. The room was bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of the screen, the words seemingly dancing on the surface, inviting yet ominous. The air was thick with a palpable tension, a sense of anticipation that clung to the back of her throat like a half-swallowed secret. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, a steady, insistent drumbeat that echoed in her ears, drowning out the usual hum of the world outside. She had seen the message, the one that had been circulating, whispered about in hushed tones, shared in frantic, desperate emails. A message from God, they said. A final warning, a last chance to repent, to change their ways before it was too late. She had scoffed at first, dismissing it as the ramblings of some overzealous doomsday prophet. But then the isolation had begun. The streets had emptied, the shops had closed, the world had ground to a halt. And now here she was, alone in her apartment, staring at the screen, the words seeming to pulse and throb, demanding her attention. She reached out a tentative hand, hovering over the keyboard, her fingers trembling like the leaves of an aspen in a storm. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and then began to type. The words flowed from her, a torrent of fear and confusion, of anger and despair. She poured out her heart, her soul, her very being onto the screen, laying bare her innermost thoughts and feelings, her darkest fears and deepest hopes. And then she waited. The seconds ticked by, each one an eternity, a chasm of silence that stretched out before her, vast and yawning. She could hear the blood rushing in her veins, the steady tick of the clock on the wall, the distant hum of the refrigerator, and then a soft chime, a gentle notification that cut through the silence like a knife. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest, as the words began to appear on the screen. They were simple, straightforward, yet they sent a shiver down her spine, a cold, creeping dread that coiled around her heart and squeezed. "You are the chosen one," they read. "You have been isolated for a reason. You must prepare, for the end is nigh. The time has come to make a choice, to stand up and be counted. The fate of the world rests in your hands." She stared at the words, her mind racing, her thoughts, a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She didn't understand, couldn't comprehend the magnitude of what was being asked of her. She was just an ordinary person, a nobody who had been thrust into the spotlight, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. But as she sat there, the words burning into her retina, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, a sense of purpose, of determination, of resolve. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know what challenges and trials lay ahead, but she knew one thing, knew it with a certainty that burned like a flame in her heart. She would not back down. She would not falter. She would stand up and she would fight. For herself, for her loved ones, for the world. And so, with a deep breath and a steady hand, she began to type once more, her fingers flying across the keyboard, her words a beacon of hope in the darkness, a promise of a brighter tomorrow. The chosen one had been chosen, and the world would never be the same again. The room was bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of the screen, the words seemingly dancing on the surface, inviting yet ominous. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, a palpable sense of anticipation that clung to the walls like a second skin. The message, cryptic and enigmatic, had cast a spell over the room, binding its occupants in a shared moment of suspense. The man, whose name was John, felt a strange sensation creep up his spine, a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. His eyes were glued to the screen, his mind racing, trying to decipher the meaning behind the words. He was no stranger to the mysteries of the universe, having spent a lifetime in pursuit of answers. But this was different. This was a message from God, or so it claimed, and it had been sent to him and him alone. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, itching to respond, to engage with the divine entity that had reached out to him. But he hesitated, a small voice in the back of his mind, whispering warnings of deception, of trickery. He had heard stories of false prophets, of charlatans who preyed on the vulnerable, who twisted the words of God to suit their own nefarious purposes. He did not want to be fooled, to be led astray by a cunning impostor. But the message was insistent, pressing, demanding his attention. It spoke of isolation, of a world on the brink of chaos, of a final warning to the chosen one. John felt a shiver run through him, a sense of foreboding that he could not shake. He knew that he could not ignore this message, that he had to respond, had to engage with the entity that had reached out to him. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. His fingers danced over the keyboard, typing out a response, a question, a plea for understanding. He asked for clarification, for proof of the entity's divine nature. He demanded to know why he had been chosen, why he was the recipient of this final warning. The room seemed to hold its breath as he pressed enter, as the message was sent out into the void, into the vast expanse of the digital universe. The seconds ticked by, each one an eternity, as John waited for a response, for an answer to his questions. He felt a sense of dread building in the pit of his stomach, a gnawing fear that he was stepping into something far beyond his comprehension, far beyond his control. And then the response came. The screen flickered, the words, shifting, rearranging themselves into a new message, a new warning. John's heart pounded in his chest as he read the words, as he absorbed the meaning behind them. The message was clear, unambiguous, a stark warning of the dangers that lay ahead. It spoke of a world on the brink of destruction, of a society teetering on the edge of chaos. It spoke of a chosen one, of a savior who would rise from the ashes, who would lead the world back from the brink. John felt a sense of awe, of reverence as he read the words. He knew that he was in the presence of something divine, something holy. He knew that he had been chosen, that he had a role to play in the grand scheme of things. He did not know what that role was, did not know what was expected of him, but he knew that he had to rise to the challenge, had to answer the call. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be obstacles and challenges, that there would be those who sought to undermine him, to thwart his efforts. But he also knew that he was not alone, that he had the guidance of a higher power, of a divine entity that had chosen him for this task. He closed his laptop, the screen fading to black, the words disappearing into the ether. He stood up, his resolve, strengthened his purpose, clarified. He knew what he had to do, knew the path that lay before him. He was the chosen one, the savior of the world, and he would not let the world down. He would rise to the challenge, would answer the call, would lead the world back from the brink of destruction, and he would do it with the guidance of God, with the strength of the divine, with the power of faith. The room was bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of the screen, casting long shadows that danced macabrely on the walls. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, a palpable sense of dread that seemed to seep from the very pores of the device, now silent, its message delivered. The words on the screen, stark and unyielding, seemed to burn themselves into the retinas of those who stared unblinking at the stark proclamation. This is the final warning. Repent, for the end is nigh. Outside, the world had stilled. The usual cacophony of life, the hum of traffic, the distant chatter of people going about their days had all but vanished. The streets were empty, the shops closed their windows, dark and foreboding. The sky, once a vibrant canvas of blue, was now a gloomy shroud of gray, heavy with the promise of an impending storm. The air was thick with an almost electric charge, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. In the silence, the weight of the message settled heavily upon the shoulders of those who had received it. The words, though simple, carried with them a gravity that was impossible to ignore. They were a clarion call, a desperate plea from a higher power, a final attempt to steer humanity away from the precipice upon which it teetered. The message was clear: change your ways or face the consequences. But the world, it seemed, was slow to heed the warning. The initial shock had worn off, and in its place was a sense of unease, a gnawing fear that refused to be ignored. People huddled in their homes, their eyes glued to the screens that had brought them the message, their minds racing with a myriad of questions and fears. Some turned to prayer, their voices raised in a chorus of desperation, seeking solace and guidance in the face of the unknown. Others turned to each other, their voices hushed and urgent, their eyes wide with a shared sense of dread. Yet there were those who scoffed, who dismissed the message as nothing more than a hoax, a cleverly crafted prank designed to sow chaos and fear. They went about their days as if nothing had happened, their laughter ringing out in the empty streets, their voices a stark contrast to the somber mood that had descended upon the world. But even they could not escape the sense of unease that had settled over the land, the feeling that something was not quite right. As the days passed, the world began to change. The skies darkened, the winds grew colder, and the once vibrant greenery of the earth began to wither and die. The message had been clear, and the consequences were now beginning to manifest. The end, it seemed, was truly nigh. In the face of this, the world began to unite. The divisions that had once plagued humanity, the borders that had once separated nations, began to dissolve. People came together, their differences set aside in the face of a common enemy. They turned to each other for comfort, for support, for guidance. They prayed together, their voices raised in a chorus of hope and desperation. And as they did, they began to change. The message had reached them, had touched them in a way that no other message ever had. It had awakened something within them, a sense of purpose, a sense of unity, a sense of hope. They began to see the world in a new light, to understand their place in it, to understand the consequences of their actions. The world was changing, and with it, so were its inhabitants. The message had been received, and it was beginning to take effect. The end was nigh, but it was not the end that they had feared. It was the end of an era, the end of a way of life, the end of a world that had been on the brink of destruction. And from the ashes of that world, a new one was beginning to emerge. A world that was united, a world that was hopeful, a world that was ready to face whatever came next. The screen, now dark, stood as a silent testament to the change that had come over the world. Its message had been delivered, its purpose fulfilled. And as the world began to heal, to grow, to thrive, it stood as a reminder of the power of unity, of the power of hope, of the power of a message from God. The room was bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of the screen, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to whisper secrets of their own. The air was thick with anticipation. The silence so profound it was as if the very world outside had paused to listen. She sat there, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, her heart pounding a staccato rhythm against her ribs. The message on the screen pulsed a beacon of urgency that she could not ignore. Her name was Eleanor, and she was no stranger to the extraordinary. She had spent her life chasing the whispers of the divine, the echoes of something greater than herself. And now here it was, a message from God, or so it claimed. She had found it buried in the depths of an obscure forum, a single post that stood out like a beacon amidst the noise. It spoke of isolation, of a world on the brink of something monumental, something terrifying. And it spoke of a chosen one, a final warning. Eleanor's breath hitched as she read the words again, her eyes scanning the lines as if they held the secrets of the universe. The message was clear yet cryptic, a riddle wrapped in a prophecy. It spoke of a time of trial, of a world that would be tested and found wanting. It spoke of a chosen one who would rise to lead the way, to guide the lost through the darkness. And it spoke of isolation, of a world that would be cut off, separated from the divine, from the source of all life. She felt a shiver run down her spine, a cold finger of fear tracing its way along her vertebrae. The message was a warning, a final plea for the world to change its ways, to turn back from the brink. But it was also a call to action, a summons to the chosen one to rise and lead. And Eleanor, with her heart full of faith and her soul burning with purpose, knew that she was the one. She had to be. She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she began to type. She would respond to the message, would offer herself up as the chosen one, the leader the world so desperately needed. She would not fail, could not fail. The fate of the world depended on it. As she typed, the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching and twisting like living things. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the gravity of her decision pulling at her very soul. But she did not waver. She could not. She hit send, the message disappearing into the void of the internet, carried away on the wings of electrons and light. And as she waited for a response, she could not help but feel that she was standing on the precipice of something great, something terrible, something that would change the world forever. She was the chosen one, the final warning, and she would not let the world down. The room was bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of the screen, the words seeming to dance and shimmer as if alive. The air was thick with an almost electric tension, a sense of something profound and momentous hanging heavy in the silence. The message, cryptic and enigmatic, had been read and reread, each word dissected and pondered, yet its true meaning remained elusive, slipping through the fingers of understanding like smoke. The world outside had changed, shifted on its axis in ways both subtle and stark. The isolation, once a mere suggestion, had become a stark reality, a physical manifestation of the message's warning. The streets, once bustling with life, were now eerily empty, the usual hum of activity replaced by an unsettling silence. The isolation was not just physical, but emotional, a chasm of disconnection that yawned wide and deep, swallowing the familiar comforts of human interaction. In the quietude, the message echoed louder, its words resonating with a newfound urgency. It was as if the very air was charged with a divine energy, a palpable sense of the sacred. The message was not just a warning, but a call to action, a summons to the final chosen ones. The isolation was not a punishment, but a purification, a cleansing of the soul, in preparation for the trials to come. The chosen ones, scattered and alone, felt the call deep within their beings, a stirring of the spirit that could not be ignored. They were drawn to each other not by physical proximity, but by a spiritual connection, a bond forged in the crucible of isolation. They were the ones who had heeded the message, who had taken its warning to heart and allowed it to transform them. As they came together both in the physical world and in the spiritual realm, they found strength in their shared purpose. They were no longer isolated, but united, a collective force of divine will. The message had not just warned them of the trials to come, but had also equipped them with the tools to face those trials. It was a beacon of hope in the darkness, a guiding light that illuminated the path forward. The world outside continued to change, the isolation deepening and the trials intensifying. But the chosen ones stood firm, their faith unshaken and their resolve unwavering. They were the final chosen ones, the ones who had heeded the message and embraced their destiny. And in their unity, they found the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. their spirits unbroken and their hearts aflame with the divine fire of purpose. The room was bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of the screen, the words seeming to dance and shimmer as if alive. The air was thick with a sense of anticipation, a palpable tension that clung to the walls and filled the space between them. The message, cryptic and profound, had been read and reread. Each word scrutinized, each phrase dissected, yet its true meaning remained elusive, a tantalizing enigma that danced just beyond their grasp. The man, a figure of quiet intensity, stood by the window, his silhouette stark against the darkness outside. His eyes, reflective and deep, mirrored the glow of the screen, a silent testament to the storm of thoughts that raged within. The woman, her features a study in concentration, sat at the desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, poised to delve deeper into the digital labyrinth that held the key to their isolation. The message, a missive from an unknown sender, had arrived unannounced, an intruder in their otherwise mundane existence. It spoke of a warning, a final plea from a chosen one, a figure shrouded in mystery and divinity. The words were a puzzle, a riddle wrapped in an enigma, each sentence a thread that wove a tapestry of intrigue and foreboding. The man turned from the window, his eyes meeting the woman's. There was a question in his gaze, a silent inquiry that needed no voice. She nodded, her fingers flying over the keys, the clatter a staccato rhythm that filled the silence. The screen flickered, the words shifting and changing, a digital kaleidoscope that held the promise of answers. They worked in silence, a symphony of clicks and clacks, the hum of the computer, a steady beat that pulsed in time with their hearts. The world outside faded away, a distant memory that held no sway over their singular focus. The message was their universe, now a cosmos of words and symbols that held the key to their isolation. Hours passed, the night deepened, and the glow of the screen cast long shadows that danced and flickered on the walls. The man paced his steps, a measured rhythm that echoed his thoughts. The woman's fingers never faltered, her eyes never blinked, her mind a whirlwind of logic and deduction. And then a breakthrough, a single word, a name, a clue that unlocked the door to the enigma. The man stopped, his eyes widening, his breath catching in his throat. The woman looked up, her eyes meeting his, a shared understanding passing between them. They had found the key, the first step on a journey that would lead them out of the darkness and into the light. The message, once a puzzle, now a map, a guide that would lead them through the labyrinth of their isolation. The chosen one, the sender of the message, was no longer a mystery but a beacon, a light that would guide them home. The warning, the final plea, was a call to action, a summons that could not be ignored. They stood their resolve, hardened, their purpose clear. The room, once a prison, was now a gateway, a portal that would lead them to the truth. The message, a lifeline in the storm, a promise of salvation in the face of the unknown. They were no longer isolated, no longer alone. They were chosen, called, destined to unravel the mystery and bring light to the darkness. And so, with a shared glance and a nod of understanding, they stepped forward, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The message, the warning, the chosen one, all were but the beginning of their journey. The end, the truth, the light awaited them, a beacon in the darkness, a promise of salvation in the face of the unknown. The room was bathed in the soft, ethereal glow of the screen, the words seeming to dance and shimmer as if alive. The air was thick with an almost electric tension, a sense of something profound and momentous hanging heavy in the silence. The message, cryptic and enigmatic, had been read and reread. Each word pored over, each phrase dissected, yet its true meaning remained elusive, slipping through the fingers of understanding like smoke. Outside, the world had changed. The streets, once bustling with life, were now eerily empty, the usual hum of activity replaced by an unsettling silence. The isolation was not just physical, but emotional, a chasm of disconnection that yawned wide and deep, swallowing the familiar comforts of human interaction. The reasons for this sudden shift were as unclear as the message on the screen, a puzzle with pieces that refused to fit together. In the quiet, the mind wandered, seeking patterns and connections where none might exist. The message was a beacon, a lighthouse in the storm, yet its light was a flickering thing, casting more shadows than illumination. The words, final chosen one, echoed in the chambers of the mind, a mantra that both intrigued and terrified. Who was the chosen one? What was their purpose? And why was isolation a necessary precursor to this revelation? The screen flickered, the words shifting slightly as if responding to the unspoken questions. The glow intensified, casting long dancing shadows on the walls, the room seeming to breathe and pulse with an otherworldly rhythm. The air grew colder, the silence more profound, the sense of something impending, something monumental, almost palpable. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the message vanished, the screen returning to its usual bland, unremarkable state. The room seemed to exhale the tension dissipating like mist in the morning sun. Yet the sense of something profound, something life-altering lingered. The message had been received, the isolation acknowledged, the journey begun. The path ahead was unclear, the destination unknown, but the first step had been taken. The chosen one, whoever they were, was no longer alone in their isolation. The world in its silence and emptiness was watching, waiting, ready to reveal its secrets to those who dared to seek them. In the quietude of her small apartment, the woman stared at the screen, the words swimming before her eyes, blurring like tears. The message was clear, the warning stark, and yet she felt a strange calm settle over her. She had spent years chasing meaning, searching for signs in the mundane, and now here it was, a message from the divine, and it was not what she expected. She thought of the world outside, the hustle and bustle, the noise and the chaos. The isolation had been hard, the silence deafening, but now she understood. It was not a punishment, but a gift, a chance to pause, to reflect, to listen. The message was not a threat, but a plea, a desperate cry from a world that had lost its way. She stood up, her chair scraping against the wooden floor, the sound echoing in the empty room. She walked to the window, her reflection staring back at her, her eyes filled with a newfound resolve. She would not miss this warning. She would not ignore this final call. She thought of her neighbors, her friends, her family. She would reach out to them, not with fear, but with love. She would share this message not as a prophecy of doom, but as a beacon of hope. They would listen, she knew they would. They would understand, as she had, that this isolation was not an end, but a beginning. She turned away from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a sense of purpose, a calling, a divine mission. She would not fail. She could not fail. The world was counting on her, and she would not let them down. She sat back down at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She would write, she would share, she would spread this message of hope and love. She would be the voice of the divine, the herald of the new dawn. And as she began to type, she felt a warmth spread through her, a sense of peace, of tranquility, of divine grace. The world would change, she knew it. It would not be easy, it would not be quick, but it would happen. And she would be a part of it, a catalyst, a spark in the darkness. She would be the chosen one, not in the sense of being special, but in the sense of being called. Called to serve, called to love, called to change the world. And as she typed the words flowing from her like a river, she felt a tear roll down her cheek. It was not a tear of sadness, but of joy, of hope, of divine love. She was ready. She was ready to embrace her destiny, to change the world, to be the chosen one. And as she typed the final words, she knew without a shadow of a doubt that the world would never be the same again. The message had been clear, stark against the white of the screen, a beacon of urgency in the quiet of her room. She had read it 100 times, each word etching itself deeper into her consciousness. The world outside had grown quiet, a hushed anticipation hanging heavy in the air. People had been isolating, distancing themselves from one another, a necessary evil in the face of the unseen enemy. But this message, this warning, it was different. It spoke of something greater, something divine. She had always been a skeptic, a pragmatist. God was a concept, a comfort for those who needed it. But now, as she sat alone in her room, the silence pressing in around her, she felt a shift, a stirring in the depths of her soul. The message had been sent to her specifically. Why her, she didn't know, but she felt compelled, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. The days blurred together, each one a mirror of the last. She spent her time reading, researching, seeking understanding. The world outside grew quieter still. The streets empty, the skies clear. It was as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting. She felt a sense of purpose, a calling. She was meant to understand this message, to decipher its meaning, to share its truth. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in a warm golden glow, she felt a sudden, overwhelming emotion. It was a feeling of love, of peace, a profound connection. It washed over her, filling her to the brim, spilling out into the room, into the world. She understood then in that moment the true meaning of the message. It wasn't a warning, not in the way she had thought. It was a call to unity, to love, to understanding. It was a reminder that we are all connected, all one, all divine. Tears streamed down her face as she let the emotion wash over her. She felt a profound sense of gratitude, of humility. She was not alone, not truly. She was part of something greater, something beautiful, something divine. And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. She picked up her pen, her heart pounding in her chest. She would write, she would share this message, this truth. She would reach out to the world, to her fellow humans, and she would remind them of their connection, their unity, their divinity. She would be a beacon of light in the darkness, a voice of hope in the silence. And so she began to write, her heart pouring out onto the page. She wrote of love, of unity, of the divine spark that lived within each and every one of us. She wrote of the isolation, of the fear, of the uncertainty. But she also wrote of hope, of strength, of the power of the human spirit. She wrote of the message, of its true meaning, of its call to action. As she wrote, she felt a sense of peace, of purpose. She was no longer alone, no longer isolated. She was part of something greater, something beautiful, something divine, and she knew with a certainty that filled her very soul that this was her calling. This was her path. This was her message to share with the world. And so she continued to write, her heart pouring out onto the page, her soul shining through her words. She was a messenger, a beacon, a voice in the silence, and she would not be silenced. She would share her message, her truth, her love, and she would change the world one word, one heart, one soul at a time.